Thank you, Sam, and thank everyone for the warm welcome. I'm glad to be here. You all must be exhausted. This is a really busy program with so much amazing information. You've seen globally renowned mayors and critically acclaimed authors, and now you're thinking, who's this guy? Well, the reason I'm here is because, as Sam said, we have had some luck recently in my community with really creating some density in an area that is traditionally very averse to it. To the tune that right now we have under construction or approved 1,000 high-density units with another 1,000 working their way through the planning pipeline, and this is in an area, in a town, which only approved 400 units in the entire previous decade. And so the construction activity is really ramping up, and it's in a form that is new to the area, and it's widely accepted now because of the groundwork that we've laid, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. In addition, since we've had this success, I've been asked to speak at various groups across the state to kind of sell the virtues of density and to explain how we've been able to make it happen in our community. And so I'll share some of those lessons from the road with you today as well. So Redwood City is in the San Francisco metropolitan area, about 25 miles south of San Francisco on the San Francisco Peninsula. It is a suburban community. It's at the northern end of what you could call the Silicon Valley. We have a lot of the high-tech industry in Redwood City. Shrek is made in Redwood City. Your kid's Madden football game for the Xbox is made in Redwood City, so you can curse us out every time he spends too much time on that. And so there's a lot of pressure to grow. The economy is doing really well, especially in the high-tech sector. We've had a long-standing housing shortage that is only getting worse. You can see from the map that we're hemmed in between the bay, which is protected. Even the wetlands that line it cannot be filled and developed. And likewise, we are backed up against the Santa Cruz Mountains, which are also protected, to the extent that 85% of our county is protected open space that cannot be developed. So that really leaves us this 3-mile wide strip along the bay where we have to basically where we have to make it happen. And that is forcing us to basically deal with something that we haven't wanted to deal with before, and that is density. And despite its 7 letters, you would think that it's a 4-letter word because it usually gets a reaction like this when you bring it up. But you can overcome that. And when I travel preaching this gospel, I usually start out with some disclaimers because, let's face it, you know, there is some rationality behind the fear of density. A lot of the density that we've produced on this continent over the last 50 or 60 years is not good. And people are right to revolt against it. But what the problem is with these things is not the density, it's the design. And so that's the first thing that I always try to get people to really think about. The next thing I talk about is that people have terrible concerns that when you bring up density, you're attacking their way of life or something along those lines. And so I always remind them that I have absolutely no interest in sending these gentlemen to their home to pull them out of their home by gunpoint and force them to live in some sort of terrible vertical slum. That's not my goal. I would never propose such a thing, and I would never even imply it. I also am not proposing to blanket the earth with skyscrapers, right? Skyscrapers are great. They're a part of the picture, but it's not the only thing that we need to do. And finally, I'm not attacking the single-family house. For those that need it or want it, it's great, and they should have that choice. The problem is we haven't given people much else to choose from for the last several decades. And finally, I remind people that this is not what we're talking about. Oh, that trick didn't work. It showed a skyscraper built right next to that little bungalow. So we're not going to build a skyscraper right next to their house. So as I travel around, I try to really first of all, drill into people why we need to even deal with density. If it's such a touchy subject, it's been done badly in the past, why do we need to go there? And there are several good reasons for doing that. Now, most of them have been already covered and covered in great detail, so I won't go into depth on this, but I will just briefly explain the things that have resonated with audiences in California and opened their mind to density. And first and foremost is environmental concerns. Everybody is concerned about the environment, or at least professes to be so these days. And so but a lot of them think that by buying organic shampoo, they've done their job, or by switching out their light bulbs, they're done, and they can go on, the polar bears will be fine, and that is not necessarily the case. So environmental issues can really be addressed by density. Now, population is growing, it's going to continue to grow, and those folks have to go somewhere. So the first thing I point out is that if we don't build up in existing areas, the people have to go to the forests and the wetlands and the farmland that we want to preserve. So that's the first benefit, is preserving open spaces by being more efficient with our built places. The second thing is water. In California, about 60% of urban water use goes to landscaping, not to showers and drinking water and so on and so forth, not to actual humans. At high density situations, you have less landscaping per household, much more efficient with this scarce resource. Transportation is also another huge reason to go dense, and I always remind people that in low density settings, all you can do is drive. That's the only viable way to get around, whereas we know in high density settings, transit becomes viable, walking, biking become viable, and even car trips get shorter. Another thing that a lot of people don't think about is electrical use, and electricity is often generated by burning fossil fuels, and there's emissions there too. And so in dense settings, electrical use is often a lot lower. So I remind people of that because of not only smaller unit sizes, but also multifamily units insulate each other. Whereas if you're heating a single-family home in Phoenix, or you're cooling a single-family home in Phoenix, that heat is bombarding from 5 sides into that unit. It takes a lot more energy to keep it comfortable. Now, in California right now, we have huge municipal budget problems. Every municipal government in the state, in fact, government at all levels, is really searching for ways to increase revenues and bring costs down. Density can help. This is a map of the Buffalo metropolitan area. The area in orange is the urbanized area as of 1950. The area in the red is the urbanized area as of the year 2000. The population was the same. Buffalo did not grow during this period, and yet it sprawled. Okay, so you had the same number of people paying for 3 times as many roads, 3 times as many pipes, 3 times as many everything. So either service levels have to go down or taxes have to go up. It's very expensive for the same number of people to pay for 3 times as much stuff. Another problem that cities are having revenue-wise is that in California we've become very dependent on sales tax as our primary revenue source. And car dealerships are a big part of that. The auto industry is hurting, retail is hurting, and so that revenue source is declining. And we have to look at new revenue sources. And housing has traditionally been thought of as a revenue loser, right? You house people because they need a place to live, but it costs the city money. That's only true at lower densities. At higher densities, you start to actually make money for the city. This building is an infill high-density building in Berkeley, California, across the bay, and a study was done on it. The new property tax brought by this building is actually higher than if the land had been used for high-end retail than the city would have been bringing in that scenario for sales tax. Downtown revitalization is huge throughout California. A lot of our downtowns really suffered in the middle 20th century. Some of them have come back, some of them not so much. And everybody wants their downtown to look like the one on the left. I mean the one on the right, not the one on the left. That was bad. And so what do we want about the one on the right that the one on the left doesn't have? Well, we want the buildings to be in a good state of repair and for it to look nice. We want the sidewalks to be full of people and life. But what I'm finding people really want, even more than those things, is retail and entertainment and places to eat. They want their city center to have these great urban amenities that they desire and that many of these downtowns don't currently have. And so this has been the big selling point for density in Redwood City in particular, is that the density will support these things. You build in clientele for all of these services and amenities that everybody can enjoy, even people that don't live there. If you depend solely on importing suburbanites to support your downtown restaurants and shops, you have to provide them parking like the mall, you have to do all these things, and it puts downtown at a disadvantage to competition in the suburbs, where if you build in a clientele, make it a great walkable, dense place, now it's competing in its own playing field with its own virtues, and it will do quite well. Another reason to build densely is that needs and tastes are changing. You know, the nuclear family with 2.3 kids and a dog named Spot is a declining share of demographics. Singles or no children household are really rising, and different groups want different things now, let's face it. So a lot of people, they want to spend less of their weekend mowing the lawn, they want to spend less of their weekday on the highway, and they want an alternative that would relieve them from some of those things. The Generation Y, the millennials, the hipsters, they are more friendly to urban settings than previous generations. In fact, a lot of them really, really love it, really, really want it. And let's face it, the baby boomers are aging, and they need to downsize. They need options too. Density can address some of their needs. So at this point in my presentation in California, I play a little game with the audience called Guess the Density. And people sometimes show up to public hearings or call their lawyer just based on the density number. And they think, I see this number, I know it's gonna be bad for my community, and I'm gonna fight this thing. And what I found is that when I do this game with folks, it totally relieves them of the burden of that false impression, because they realize that they really can't tell what they think they can tell from that density number. So usually I have handouts, and we spend quite a bit of time on this, but I'm just gonna give you a light version of it to give you a sense of how it works and how it really changes perceptions. So what we'll do is we'll go through a series of buildings. The screen will show a series of potential densities, and in your mind, take a note of which one you think is the right density for that project, and then we'll see how you all did. So the first building is just a standard single-family house, not too far from me in the Silicon Valley area. And it is 2 units per acre, right? Half-acre lot. And so you all probably guessed that one correctly. This is another single-family house in Davis, California, in a project called Aggie Village. And this one, despite the fact that it's a single-family home, 17 units per acre. Much, much denser. Less yard, 2 stories, smaller lot, makes all the difference in the world. Now, this is a small apartment building in Redwood City from the 1920s. The density on this one always shocks people because they love this building, 72 units per acre. This is another building that is much taller, much bigger, and yet the density, 50 units per acre. This is the Cabrini Green housing project in Chicago. This is a building from Palo Alto, California, heart of the Silicon Valley, very close to us, home of Stanford University. And it is 174 units per acre in this building. Right across the street is this building, a little taller, and yet only 51. Always throws people off. It's taller, why isn't it denser? Project number 7. People usually get this one right, 342 units per acre. All else being equal, taller is denser. And this one is a building that my mentor, who is now retired, lives in part-time, lucky dog. And I had him count up all the units for me so I could calculate the density. And it's 384 units per acre at just, 5 or 6 stories. Last one, San Francisco, downtown. This one's just for fun, 0, it's an office building. There's no units. Height doesn't necessarily mean density. So people at this point, or after about 10 more of these, always want to know, well, why in the heck are these numbers all over the place? I thought, townhouses were about this, and mid-rise was about that density, and it's all over the place. Why is it so hard? Well, the first factor that feeds into the density is obviously the height, and all else being equal, the more floors you add, the more units you'll add, the higher your density number gets, but all else is never equal. So with Cabrini Green here, we see the project from the air. A lot of the land was left open for parking lots and open spaces. This was part of Corbusier's Ville Radius philosophy of towers in the park. And so despite the fact that it's quite tall, the density is really pretty low. In fact, this program of American Public Housing, the Urban Renewal Program, actually removed more units over the course of its history than it built. This is Paris from the air in comparison. And as you can see, the land is really built up. So that's why with the lower rise buildings, they still manage to get very high densities. This is the denser Palo Alto building from the air. The red line is its lot. And you can see it covers most of the lot, and there's no parking on the site. It's very close to the main street and to transit and to the university. This is the one across the street that was taller but less dense. big generous open space in the back, and lots of parking provided, and so you get a lower number. And then finally, this is the high-rise tower. It could have been even denser, but the first 8 floors are all parking garage. And then finally, the one that nobody ever thinks about, but oh yeah, of course that's a factor once I explain it to them, is the size of the units itself. When you look at the building, you don't know if these are luxury suites or if they're studio apartments, right? And that is one of the single biggest drivers of the density number. And so one thing that we realized in Redwood City, when we decided not to regulate by density and regulate purely by height and urban form, is that if we set height limits and then went the extra step of setting a units per acre cap, then all we were doing was forcing large unit sizes, right? And what business do we have regulating in that manner? So I always point out to people now at this point that the density can be really great, but we have to design it right. And there are a few keys to really getting there. Vancouverites are very familiar with all these tricks because you pioneered a lot of them here, but we're not as familiar with them in California, and it's really important to drive this point home. And so this is the point where I usually do that. The first thing that I always remind people of is that this doesn't go everywhere. We don't want it everywhere. It doesn't need to go everywhere. It's all about putting it in the right place. So obviously the urban regional core is the place for the highest density, where you have the most jobs, where you have the most transit, where you have the most services. Put people where they can access all of these things on foot. This is where you want to put the density. You don't want a tower out on the edge of town where nobody can get to it and where the people that live in it have access to nothing. Put the greatest densities into core, and that is where you really want it. But that's not the only place density can go. This is an aerial photograph of Arlington, Virginia, right across the river from our national capital, Washington. And over the last 30 years, they have done incredible things. Study this place if you haven't already. They, in the 1970s, extended the Washington metro system into Arlington. Rather than taking the easy way out and putting it on a surface freight rail line, they paid extra money to underground it through the area connecting all the downtowns. And then they upzoned those areas within a 5-minute walk to hold incredibly high densities. And what they were able to do was to preserve single-family home areas to the right and to the left that you can see, and accommodate nearly all of their population growth in this single corridor. And so what that has done for them is basically allowed them to double their population with keeping traffic levels the same, and this 11% of the county pays over 60% of the tax revenue. So everybody benefits by lower tax rates and better services, because this is really the cash cow for the entire area. Another area where we can really densify, and there was some talk about this happening in Vancouver earlier today, is along commercial highway strips in the suburbs. Let's face it, the single-family home is the beloved part of suburbia, if there is one. This is not, right? Nobody loves this. It's just, it kind of comes with the territory. And this is where we have room to really fill things in, and where people are going to be more accepting of change than they would on their street of quaint little houses. And so this photo simulation was prepared for my region, where we have a major highway called El Camino Real that connects all the cities through the peninsula. And this is basically what it looks like. And this was shown, this was created to show how we can really fill these places in by adding buildings and improvements to the street, and how we can really transform the place, accommodate a lot of density on these linear areas, preserve the single-family areas behind, and address a lot of our goals. These streets usually already have services, they already have transit a lot of times, or they're geared perfectly for transit to be added, and so this is a good place to add some moderate densities. And this is El Camino as it goes through Redwood City presently, and this is our plan for it, which we hope it looks like when we're all done. This is not how to do density, right? One tower right smack in the middle of a low-rise area, just, randomly plopped down. And there's got to be method to it. Otherwise, if you do that, people will revolt and you will not be allowed to do any more density. So if you need density and you're committed to it, don't do that, or you'll lose the permission to make it happen. Now, walkability is really key. If you don't have a walkable environment, you're just adding more drivers per acre. Last thing you want to do. So walkability is key. Now, there's a lot to walkability. First of all is obviously street design. This is not a walkable environment, okay? You don't want to subject people to this. If you do, they will not live there. They will not walk. They will drive. But that's not the only thing. So this is what you want your streets to look like, right? So another important factor is the street network itself. Even if they're nicely designed, but they don't come together in a walkable network with short blocks and lots of connections with direct paths, you're not going to get anywhere. This is a sketch I created that's showing a hypothetical neighborhood, the red dot being the center of the neighborhood and the red circle being the theoretical 5-minute walk. The blue areas are the lots that are actually walkable to the center in 5 minutes. Now, what you can see when we take away the diagonals and we just have a straight grid, the 5-minute ped shed actually shrinks quite a bit. It's still most of the neighborhood, but not all of it. And so we need to think, how do people walk, not how does the crow fly? When you take out streets to give developers bigger lots, because they'll always tell you, I need 3 acres or I can't build anything. This is ridiculous, right? I need you to get rid of that street. Then you lose more walkability. Right? People have to walk even further to zigzag around those lots. And when you go to a full suburban pattern, then you don't get much left at all. Even if your streets are lovely, you can't get there within a reasonable amount of time, and people won't walk to the degree that you want them to. Now, another important part is how those buildings hit those sidewalks, how the buildings relate to those walkable streets. You cannot put blank walls of death lining your streets and expect people to voluntarily and happily go out and stroll. Right? Your streets need to be lined with buildings like this. If you have big department stores, you need to wrap them. The prior photo was Macy's. That was ground floor retail, just what we want, right? But that was the side. So you cannot let them do that. Even if it's the right use and the right location, design matters. But retail can't go everywhere. We don't have the need for retail to go to everywhere. We can only support so much. And so side streets, Vancouver has really pioneered the townhouse podium base to the point towers, and that is a technique that we're now employing in Redwood City too, requiring that ground floor to have active frontages. If it's not a retail area, that needs to be a stoop, a porch, some sort of active entry into individual units, so that you don't just have the active lobby and then the rest of the block is dead. Another part, and this is the touchy part if there are architects in the room, is what a term that I borrowed from an architect named Steve Mouzon called loveability, right? People need to love this density. We are already pushing them beyond their comfort zone with the density itself. We don't need to push their artistic sensibilities. Whatever they want it to look like, what people feel comfortable with, the history of the town, or people's expectations of what the future should look like, find it out and give it to them. You're pushing them in other areas that are much more important, don't push them here too. And so get in there with your citizenry and find examples and find out what people really like. Now, you're never going to design any building that everybody likes, but you can create architectural guidelines that give you a built product that most people find desirable and enjoyable. And if you do that, you'll have a lot more public support for your densification. So find out what people like and give it to them. If it's different than your personal taste, hold your nose and give it to them. You do not want your density to end up on a list like this, right? Or you will lose permission to continue your densification. You want to end up on one of these lists. Otherwise, you'll end up on this list, and then you're worse off than before you began. So in California, we have a lot of regulatory hurdles that really make it tough to densify. And we've been able to manage to overcome some of those in Redwood City. And so I'll spend the last part of my conversation talking about how we're actually getting this built. Now that we've convinced people that it's beneficial, how do we get it built on the ground? How do we turn it into a reality? The first thing we wanted to tackle was parking, right? Parking is density. Form follows parking. And if you don't address it, control the beast, then it's going to be really tough to get the densities that you want. And so, for the last 50 years on this continent, we just went out to the countryside, bought a farm, plopped our buildings in the middle, paved everything else, and if there was a little extra, hey, what's it hurt to have some extra, right? But we cannot afford to do that. Most of our densification is going to happen in areas that are already developed, and the land is expensive, and so you can't afford to waste land on just surface parking lot. You're going to deck your parking, and when you deck your parking, you're really looking at something along these lines. I get it. So it's very expensive. So lower your parking requirements, allow payment of in lieu fees, which are pooled into public parking, and encourage people to unbundle the cost of parking from the cost of the rent so that car-free people are drawn to the area and they can have a cost savings. And really get creative. This is one good technique that might help as well. Open space. We're used to open space being completely privatized, right? And backyards are great, but we've turned that into ridiculous notions like every building needs to have a nature Band-Aid. Not necessary. Pool your public open spaces into useful, good things like parks that can really be used and enjoyed, and every building doesn't need its own open space. Let the building lot hold your people, provide public open spaces, and you'll get greater density and a greater place. Even small little leftover remnants of land. This is one in Redwood City that we transformed a couple of years ago. Now it's a paseo with a dining terrace and some landscaping in the back, and it's a nice little place to get a relief from the urban environment if you're walking by and you need to take a rest. And let's not forget that streets are our premier open space, and so let's make them great too. Infrastructure. All I'm going to say is that since you're building in an existing place, your pipes are probably too small. So for the new density, find a plan to upgrade them and a development fee structure, density bonuses, some way that to fairly and predictably upgrade this infrastructure. Because if you don't, it's going to be a big wild card when developers are working out their pro forma. You're not going to get as much development as you might want if you don't plan for this in advance and help people figure out how it's going to affect their project. Finally, the planning process. Now, people have a right to have a say in their community and how their community builds out. But what we did in Redwood City is we had all of that debate and all of that blood, sweat, and tears up front. And then we did our plan, we wrote our form-based code, and now anybody that comes in and follows that does not need to have a big NIMBY fight with every project. If they deviated from the code, all bets would be off. But if they follow the code, this has already been done, and they get approved. We just approved a project in 5 months that would normally have taken 2 or 3 years to entitle. Same thing with environmental rules. If you have environmental rules that you're working with, look at the entire area, figure out the environmental impacts of the entire build out, and mitigate for the entire area rather than requiring a huge and costly environmental impact report from every project. Don't regulate by dwelling units per acre, regulate by building type. Find out what building types you want, what heights you want, and then code for that rather than for dwelling units per acre. And so here are the results in Redwood City that we've been seeing. This is a new project under construction. We used to prohibit anything above 40 units per acre. This is now on the low end of what we're seeing. This is along El Camino Real, the major commercial corridor. This is on another commercial corridor under construction. This one was just finished. This is a small infill lot that's quite dense, 105 units per acre on a 5,000 square foot lot, 50 feet wide. This one just began construction, the densest building ever built in Redwood City, and probably in the entire county. This is another proposed project as well. So it can be done, it can be great, and there's a lot riding on it. So let's go out there and make it happen. Thank you.